Well, hello and welcome to another edition of No Nonsense with Pamela Wallen. Carbon taxes are being canceled all over the place by all parties. Pierre Poilievre says technology, not taxes. That's the way to go if we want to see more development. Prime Minister Carney says he intends to stay on track to net zero. So that will mean emissions cuts, which of course the industry says will force them to keep energy in the ground at the very time that we're looking for new markets and all of that. So we are going to discuss energy, the issue, the energy file, because this is going to be front and center in the election anyway you cut it. Our guest, Brian Zinchuk, Bronwyn Eyre. So both of them have been on the podcast before. Brian he's the pipeline guy. So he's got all sorts of university degrees, but he also went and worked in the patch and then and became a journalist and writes about the sector with a really very particular knowledge. Bronwyn was the minister, I should say that, past tense, just so everybody knows where you sit, former Saskatchewan Minister of Energy Resources and Minister of Justice, where she fought some of the legal battles, she's a lawyer, against the federal government for things like Bill 69 and Bill 59 and all of those things. So they have joined forces. When we last talked to Brian, he was doing Pipeline Online. That's a podcast, and now they're co-hosting it. So that's a lot of information, but I just wanted to situate everybody here today. Thank you both for being with us. It's terrific.
Awesome to have you here. I just want to point out one thing, though.
Yeah.
The reason I went into pipeline construction is because I did not finish my degree. So,
okay, well, you were engineering and you were doing this and that, and then you went out and got your hands dirty. So
absolutely.
You actually know what the hell you're talking about, which I think is always a good thing. All right, so let's just. There's so many places to start. I don't even know, but I thought it was interesting that we finally have seen a letter from all of the key players in the energy sector, written to all the party leaders, because it's campaign time, saying, look, this is our moment. This is a key turning point in Canadian politics and history, and we have really got to get our act together. We've talked about this for years, whether it's internal, trade tariffs that we put on ourselves or developing, everything is always a plan for the future. So this letter, Bronwyn, coming out from these key players, do you think it'll have any kind of impact? This message is pretty powerful.
Well, I guess one thing I would say is that their moment was at least 10 years ago. Right. and I was always frustrated, as energy minister and remain somewhat frustrated that they haven't been more vocal and weren't more vocal sooner. It's risky for them. I mean, it always has been, and I suppose always will be if they for those who sympathize with them, there's always the risk that the narrative is, they're big oil. They have vested interests, and if you like them, you just like the sector. If you don't, of course, there's generally, it falls pretty clearly on the, how do you feel about oil generally? And then if so I think that is always a risk for them, but I think they could have been more creative and more vocal much, much earlier. Obviously now we are in such a state of, internal self-harm as a federation, particularly when it comes to the sector. That they should have been pointing this out, as I say, in very creative ways and innovative ways much sooner. They have big marketing departments and very big funds behind them in terms of pocketbook strength. And they could have thought this through, I think, more innovatively earlier. But
and they also will tell you, which you well know too, that Bill 59, which was supposed to be targeting greenwashing, has actually kind of had has had a silencing effect on the industry, that they're not sure what they should say out loud or put out for communications because they might get hammered.
Mm-hmm. So they've been so compromised for so long on needing money from governments, particularly the federal government, and for the bigger players, certainly around carbon capture, utilization, and storage, CCUS, CCS. They were very wary of criticizing the federal government because they needed that money, which never really was forthcoming, to the degree they wanted it. The check was always in the mail. And as a result, they didn't speak up on, enough, in my view, on everything from Bill C-69, federal fuel standard, down the list. And so here we are, and here they are. And I think that they realize, and they are genuinely frightened by Bill C-59, the greenwashing bill, because they feel that if they speak out, there's true danger in their promoting themselves and their sustainability records, such as they are publicly. So they're panicking now.
Yeah.
I got to say here,
go ahead, Ron.
It's absolutely about time that they actually said something. I mean, I've been making more noise in these fights from my basement in Estevan, Saskatchewan, than people who have entire office towers and floors of lawyers to fight Bill C-59. And the reason C-59 came in the first place is because the federal government walked all over them for the last 10 years, and they just took it. If they had stood up and really fought for Northern Gateway and for Energy East, and did not take this line down. And I'm saying the CEOs of the biggest companies, the pipeline companies, if they had fought and said, no, we keep the lights on, and didn't take all this, we wouldn't be where we are today, where Trump can say, oh, we don't really need your oil. We're going to tariff it. We would be in a much better position now because we'd be much more diversified. Northern Gateway was supposed to be in service, I think, in 2017. Energy East in 2018, we would be exporting to Europe right now. Projects like Energy Saguenay in Quebec would not have been killed if we had actually had these people stand up and fight.
At that point, it's hard because when you're in the East or outside of Western Canada, let me put it that way, it's hard to make the case and explain to people the level of contribution that oil, gas, and agriculture make to the economy. I mean, I sometimes just say to people, it's great that you have daycare and healthcare, but you wouldn't if there wasn't an oil and gas sector and in our neck of the woods, a robust agriculture sector.
Well, it's utterly critical. I mean, today's budget day in Saskatchewan, and resource revenues compared to what they were 10 years ago are substantially lower. I did a calculation once, I think it was 2012, when oil was over $100 a barrel. And at that time, the biggest part of a budget is usually around 38 to 40% for healthcare. Today it's 38%. I calculated that volume of revenue coming from oil and gas paid for every single doctor, nurse, old folks home, hospital, and ambulance south of Craven, Saskatchewan. That was inclusive of Regina, Estevan, Weyburn, and Moose Jaw, because it was almost 40% of the health budget. It's not as much today, in large part because we didn't do all those projects I talked about, and we have been suffering for 10 years.
And I think you can extrapolate out that this is true for the federal economy. I mean, we have seen in our country, we've got record low levels of investment. We've got productivity issues, mostly relative to the U.S., but even to our partners in the other G7 countries. We can't afford to keep this in the ground, and we really can't afford to keep it in the ground when we're facing losing access, or at least having our relationship with the U.S. tariffed so substantially.
Well, and isn't it a tragedy, Senator, that you point out how difficult it is to get the message across in central Canada, for example, when after all, it is the biggest export. And, when there was talk about counter tariffs to the Trump tariffs, and obviously that is an ongoing discussion around, should there be counter tariffs, for example, on the most valuable export, which is oil and gas, for example, from Alberta and to a degree Saskatchewan. Everyone suddenly wakes up to that fact, and they wake up to the fact that, it's of a major value when it comes to paying for things, obviously, from a federal perspective, but equalization is another one. I mean, we're at a point where we've been contemptuous of a commodity, which is funding the nation and our biggest export. We wake up to that fact, and we're suspiciously, and really it's a great shame how uninterested we are, not only in the oil and gas sector, but let's look at these tariffs, 100% tariffs on canola, in Saskatchewan, also impacting the fishermen in the Maritimes, and somehow held to ransom, as a number of fishers have said, for EV policies.
No, we did a whole podcast on that last week. That was our podcast and because it had not made, never mind the front page anywhere. It hadn't made page 27 anywhere, or a newscast. And this is a $40 billion industry, right? And with 100% tariff on it. So how serious do you think, Brian, we are on this tariff issue, and what it will mean in terms of taking this stuff out of the ground? And then I'm going to come to the second part of that question, which is about the views of the current Prime Minister, Mr. Carney, on this issue. But Daniel has done, in Alberta, Daniel Smith's done a bit of negotiation to keeping the tariffs down to 10%, but who knows? Every day it changes. Is this going to have a huge impact?
Well, I've talked to a few CEOs who have Saskatchewan production here about specifically that. What is the impact of a 10% tariff? Now, there's a huge difference between a 10% and a 20% tariff. And I think the reason the United States did that is because they still need our oil. They absolutely need our oil.
Right.
And
despite what President Trump says, they still need it.
Yeah. And what happens is that the center of the United States, the Midwest, largely uses Canadian oil, and their refineries are tooled to take Canadian oil. All oil is not the same. When your refinery can take a certain slate of product, it can't easily take other stuff. So the Midwest is largely centered around taking Canadian oil. And that allows the United States to export light crude oil from the southern states, from Texas and New Mexico, into export markets. They buy our oil cheap, usually right now it's about a $12 discount. I've seen as high as $40 in the past, back when Bronwyn was minister. And they sell their product at a higher rate on the world market. So they're getting, this whole trade deficit that Trump is saying, it's horrible that we have this huge deficit. They're actually benefiting, 10, 20, 30% per barrel on every barrel they do this exchange with. So these CEOs I asked, I said, so what's going to be the impact? It's going to hurt you much? And they both said almost word for word that because the Canadian dollar is in free fall,
is so low,
and because they get paid in American dollars and they pay their expenses in Canadian dollars, at 10% tariff, it actually works out to almost a wash. It's really not hurting those oil companies in particular. Now, everyone else in the economy, absolutely. But for that product itself, it doesn't hurt them that bad. And I think that's probably why he chose 10% for that.
Yeah, somebody did the math. I raised the question about this because I was just reading something that Jason Kenney, the former Premier of Alberta, said. He was at the big mining convention in Toronto recently, and he was talking about the Ring of Fire, which we heard this week, of course, from Pierre Poilievre. He's really put that one in the window and said, come on, let's just do it. We're going to get these things done in 6 months. We always just talk about it. Jason Kenney said when he was at that conference, he's talking to industry people who say, I don't know if we want to get involved in that kind of project, developing critical minerals, because they estimated, Bronwyn, it would take 16 years to go all through the regulatory legislative approvals hoop. That is just frightening.
Yeah. Well, and we've seen this movie before, right? Because Premier Ford came in guns blazing on the Ring of Fire when he was first elected. And that was the famous quote where he talked about the bulldozer and how he was going to make it happen and so on. I completely sympathize. I mean, of course, the Ring of Fire should be developed. It holds enormous potential around critical minerals. The problem is, again, our self-harm, and also the dimension which comes up again and again, and certainly has been experienced with the Ring of Fire, which is the Indigenous duty to consult component, which can be, time consuming and certainly not a 6-month proposition. So it just all depends on the will. And because Bill C-69 comes to bear on some of these things for major projects, Ring of Fire would constitute a lot of major projects, and Bill C-69 has come into play on the Ring of Fire. It can come down on animal species protection. It can come down on the impact of building highways to get to mines. And there have been impacts about Bill C-69 on the Ring of Fire. So all the best. Certainly, the will is hopeful to hear. I mean, on the part of Mr. Poilievre, but that is going to be challenging. And I think we just have to be honest about that. Obviously, it would be wonderful if it were different, but they're going to be challenging.
I think this has a lot to do with how Canada, but this is before my time. Jimmy Carter once gave a speech about the United States being in a malaise. And when it comes to resource development, that is absolutely the case here. Like, we built the original Trans Mountain Pipeline with equipment that most of it didn't even have hydraulics, never mind computers or GPS. They built that in 16 months. And now with modern equipment, which is 3 to 4 times as powerful and has every single modern convenience you can imagine, took us 4 years. The reality is that in the oil patch, everything takes forever now because of
the consultations.
Well,
it's not the just consultations, that. And it's also it's purely about ideology. Right. I mean, to Brian's point, if there's a will, there's a way. Absolutely, there is and was previously. But I mean, we see an ideological bent and have on, for example, the carbon tax, where that was the national emergency argument, which the federal government brought forth at the Supreme Court, that it was, climate is a national emergency. If the will were that energy were a national emergency, as we're seeing, with the president. Unleashing Alaska, unleashing drill, baby, drill, and so on. Yeah. Certainly, from a will perspective, completely different position.
I can give you an example from the pipeline industry, because when I got married in '99, we went and built the Alliance Pipeline. We started in June and we worked throughout the whole summer. And then after that, for the last 25 years, because of a Migratory Bird Act, we cannot build nationally regulated pipelines in the summer. So they're built in the wintertime when it's, icy and slippery and takes, twice as long. And yet the farmer can crop that exact same land and he can run his air seeder over that exact same birdie's nest and cause whatever havoc they do to migratory birds. That has no impact. But if you're an oil company trying to build a pipeline, and interesting, it's only nationally regulated pipelines. I can build a provincial regulated pipeline, no problem.
Right. Just give us a word or two, Brian, on the state of pipelines, because we've heard Mr. Carney say his version of we need to sort of unleash all these resources we have. But he does say something different in the province of Quebec and in the language, in the French language. So what are you thinking? What are you reading into that?
There's been more discussion about getting 2 pipelines in particular built in the last 8 weeks than it has been in the last 5 years since those projects died. Almost 10 years, actually, for Energy East. For Northern Gateway. So there's talk about building a pipeline to the west coast that, like Northern Gateway, and another one to the east coast, which will go through Quebec to St. John, New Brunswick, Energy East. The problem is that both of those proponents each lost about $1 billion that they wrote off in designing these projects. Now, the plans are there. They're on a hard drive or they're on a shelf somewhere. All this work has been done and it could be potentially refreshed, but everyone says, well, let's go build it. But those companies are not, as far as we know, maybe they have a tiger team that's working quietly. They're not actually saying, we're going to go ahead and Mark II of Energy East.
They've seen the movie before.
Yeah, and they're just not lining up to go into the box office. So,
and none of the policies have changed. I mean, as far as Prime Minister Carney, he hasn't signaled anything about, Bill C-69, as far as I know, or let alone federal fuel standard or electricity regulations.
Let's just talk about that for a moment, because the clean fuel standard, let's just call it what it is, like an emissions cap. Like, he wants to put a cap on the amount of emissions that was previous Liberal government. That stays the same under Mr. Carney. And this, as anybody in the industry will tell you, and the farmers will tell you this too, it really is a production cap. It means you have to leave stuff in the ground, and there's just stuff you can't do if you're going to meet those standards. So it seems like as long as we're hell bent on net zero and emission reductions, I don't know how we develop the industry so that we can sell our wonderful product to other sources or maybe again to Americans. But you need to be able to do two things at once.
Yeah, and you can talk is cheap. I mean, you can talk about unleashing whatever you like, but as Brian has said, it's about private companies at the end of the day.
Right.
And there's the duty to consult aspect. And then if you leave all the patchwork of regulations in place and don't signal you're going to get rid of any of them, then you have the same malaise words that we already have. I mean, the oil and gas cap absolutely is a production cap. And, the parliamentary budget officer came out recently, only very selectively reported, I might add, Blacklock's was one, about the impact, more disastrous than had been expected. And the numbers that we're talking about,
$20 billion hit to GDP, 40 to 50,000 jobs. Those are serious numbers.
Absolutely. And they're so big. And the independent Saskatchewan First Economic Tribunal in Saskatchewan also studied the oil and gas cap. And the numbers become so huge in terms of impact, they almost become bizarrely abstract. But the bottom line is, yes, it's a production cap, and yes, it is absolutely destructive. What is Prime Minister Carney's position going to be on that if he's going to unleash anything? And that's just one of many, right? I mean, the federal fuel standard, carbon tax number 2, we've been saying that for years.
I was waiting for Bronwyn
to... Go ahead, Brian, but I was
waiting for Bronwyn to use her line, about clean fuel standard being the second carbon tax. Reality is there's multiple ones, because we have the consumer carbon tax, and we have the clean fuel standard, which did drive canola crush plants. I will say that. And then we have the output-based pricing system, which is the industrial carbon tax.
Right.
So when Mark Carney goes on there and says, basically replicating what Chrétien did back in the 90s when he said, I will take my pen and write 0 helicopters Chrétien. Carney basically did the same thing and said we're getting rid of the carbon tax, but the output-based carbon tax or pricing system, that's on SAS Power, that's on the natural or the oil and gas companies and their things, and he's actually talking about increasing that. And the excuse I heard just the other day is that when he was in Europe, he's saying, oh well, if we want to trade with Europe because the United States doesn't want to be nice to us, well, we have to have a carbon tax so they won't trade with us. But my answer to that is that when Olaf Scholz, the Chancellor of Germany, came to Canada and said, please give us LNG, and Prime Minister Trudeau said, well, no, we might give you some hydrogen, but no, we're not going to do any LNG. He promptly went and talked to Qatar, and within a couple of weeks signed a multi-decade deal to buy all sorts of LNG from Qatar. And I'm fairly certain they don't have any sort of pricing system for carbon coming up.
It's just completely ridiculous, that whole that you can't trade.
It's not, that's kind of, as you say, Bronwyn, this is part of the ideological argument that do all of the people that were part of GFANS and Mr. Carney's group about I want to get to that question, the financing, in just a second. Let me just go back to Brian, because there is the consumer carbon tax, and both parties have taken that away. And then the industrial carbon tax, Mr. Poilievre has said it's gone. Mr. Carney says it's not. But he's also going to have what Mr. Carney talks about, which is kind of a shadow carbon tax, which will be almost like a tariff on the U.S. And Mr. Guilbeault, who I think has been given a promotion by becoming the Quebec lieutenant, has also said, downplayed, oh, well, we've just taken it down to 0 for now. And we have dozens of other ways to raise the money. Like, it doesn't seem like it's going too far away.
Sure describes a bait and switch there, doesn't it, Pamela?
Yeah. Looks a little bit.
We're going to get rid of it, but it's still there. I mean, until the law has changed to eliminate this, until that has passed royal assent, it's the law of the land. And if they can, get rid of it by, signing a piece of paper, which was not an order in council, they can bring it back just as quick.
Yeah. Yeah, I think that's kind of the issue. So, and the other one that's sitting there is the impact, and this was certainly Mr. Carney's preoccupation for the last many years as the UN climate advisor in the GFAN. This group, which wants all of the financial institutions, banks and pension funds and insurance companies to basically make money difficult for those that are developing traditional oil and gas, and make it totally accessible for those that are doing what are declared or decreed to be green projects. And that seems to still be on the table, Bronwyn, that issue. I mean, he didn't walk away from that in any way. I know the campaign is just, we're just at the beginning, but that could have a profound impact, although we're also seeing banks and big investors say, we don't want to play that game anymore. We want to make business decisions.
Well, and I think, frankly, they were nervous about being sued. I mean, that it was interesting how psychologically and otherwise rapidly they bailed from that banking alliance, that UN-backed alliance, which he had co-founded, as soon as they read the room on Trump's re-election, and they were gone. Yeah. And so I think there were really serious concerns about where being a part of that alliance from a business perspective left them in terms of vulnerabilities, down the road. So that was very interesting. But I mean, clearly the fact that he co-founded this alliance, UN-backed, on, leading through green, in terms of the banking cycle, it shows his colors absolutely in terms of just where he comes from an ideological and policy perspective. The signing thing, the quote unquote executive order, which he signed, we all know has really no value. They clearly you'd have delayed the carbon tax being increased on April 1 because they want to win the election. I'm extremely skeptical about where that will go. I think he's going to hide it, repackage it. And it will come out in a different form. There is no question, but they are just biding time. That is what they are doing, and that's what he's doing.
I don't think that leopard's changing his spots, to carry on with Bronwyn's metaphor there. I mean, how much of his life has been dedicated to pricing carbon dioxide, because supposedly carbon dioxide is going to be the end of the world. And all of a sudden to say, well, it's not popular, so we're going to get rid of it. I mean, everything he's done for the last 10 years has been focused on this, and now all of a sudden he's the prime minister and it's going to disappear?
Well, and Brian, you raise a good point, because that's what we heard from people like Stephen Guilbeault for the last 10 years, which is the planet will burn if we don't have a carbon tax. Okay, we're not going to have a carbon tax. So, and it's a little hard to make that argument, isn't it?
Well, I mean, where's China's carbon tax? Where is the United States does not have a carbon tax? So, getting back to the whole trade issue, I mean, not only are we being tariffed, but we're being punished by our own carbon taxes. Beat me harder. How much more can I take? That's really what
Jason Kenney has pointed out. I mean, the Harper government did 39, trade deals? I mean, there was no carbon tax in the mix. I have never heard Germany, Japan, Britain, France demand that Canada have a carbon tax in terms of trade. It was Canada which walked away from the trading, the trade negotiations with the UK last year over supply management. It has absolutely zip to do with how we don't have a carbon tax. We walked away. Carney goes over to the UK and pretends that this is going to get rolling again based on him. I mean, it's just absolutely optics here.
Well, Premier Moe was talking on a similar line here just last week about the fact that we brought in 100% tariffs on Chinese electric vehicles. And he said he's never seen a Chinese electric vehicle. Neither have I. I don't know if you've seen any out east there. But yet, because of that, retaliatory tariffs. And we were doing this to support the United States, our best friend.
Yeah, I think Prime Minister Trudeau did that at the behest of Joe Biden. Let's put some heat on China. So he put 100% tariff on Chinese EVs, and our canola sector and East Coast lobsters are the target.
Well, I mean, so for example, driving out when you're heading out back home there to Medina, in the summertime. You know, 1/3 of all the farmland in Saskatchewan on any particular summer is canola. It's the highest priced crop, typically speaking. You can only grow it 1 out of every 3 years. So it is maximized that pretty much every farmer who's got any land worth anything grows canola every 3rd year. They built 2 canola crushing plants literally across the backyard from my mother in Yorkton. One is doubled in size for James Richardson International. The second one is currently under construction, doubling its size. That's a lot of jobs in Yorkton, as an example. That's value-added processing. Now, all that is under threat, not just for the tariffs to sell into China, 100% tariff, but also 25% tariff to go into the United States.
Yeah.
You know, so, I mean, you're damned if you do, you're damned if you don't. We're damned in every situation.
And what I think is the most, what I think is the most shocking thing is that there's no mention by the new Prime Minister of that impact on people in the West. I mean, have they so made that divide clear in their heads that we don't matter, that even farmers, the impact on canola is something that isn't really raised or dealt with or brought up? I mean, it really, and it goes back to our original points about the energy similarly, and how we just out of sight, out of mind, or willful blindness.
It really does astound me, and we had Sylvain Charlebois on talking about it, and there's been a lot of reaction to us putting it up online, but because people don't know, because they didn't read about it, because it wasn't reported anywhere. So, you know, when you explain to people that, you know, why would they, and China is our second largest customer, you know, America being the largest for canola, like it's just, why did they do that? I think it's the same conversation I have with people about, do you know that Canada, Eastern Canada, uses Saudi oil and Venezuelan oil and even Russian oil in kind of the back door, when we're sitting on a whole bunch of it? It looks like it's right behind Brian's head there, but, you know.
Oh, we got the drilling rig here and a pump jack there and a service rig over here. If I could just touch on this for a second here. I mean, you know, we have to ask ourselves, why is Trump doing this? I do agree with Prime Minister Trudeau in that he is serious about wanting to take over Canada. I really think that he wants to hurt our economy to the point where we're going to have double-digit unemployment, 15, maybe even 20%. He's going to put us into a depression. And the biggest stick that Canada has to fight back is to go to Gretna, Manitoba, turn off the valves on the Enbridge main line and say, we're cutting you off. And Premier Smith has already hinted if that happens, there'll be
and Doug Ford said it about electricity. Yeah.
There'll be a referendum the next day.
Right? He got his head bitten off because he went down there and it was all this raw stuff about he was heading down there and he was going to tell them what's what. And again, to your point, Senator, about underreporting. I mean, that was just not reported. You had to go searching for what happened when he actually went down there, because what happened is that he had to apologize for suggesting that he would turn off the electricity because Trump said, don't you basically dare. I mean, it all goes back to this narrative.
Yeah, I think there was pressure on him from the Canadian side too, because again, a new prime minister coming in doesn't want to have thunder stolen by a provincial premier, right? So there's some of that at play. But
if I can just finish there. So what's his ultimate motivation? I mean, everyone knows he's all about ego. It always has been. He's now the most powerful man in the world. He's looking at his legacy. Who is on Mount Rushmore? It is the guy who started the country, the guy who doubled the size of a country through the Louisiana Purchase, Jefferson, the guy who saved the country, and the guy who built the Panama Canal. Okay, well, what's he talking about? Shortly after inauguration, he talked about, the borders of the United States have not changed in decades. Maybe we should do it. If he, by some manner, is able to absorb Canada, and I mean, how many times has he said it now? 20, 30? 40 times? This is not a minor thing. Members of his staff in the White House are openly being recorded by media talking about the annexation of Canada. We need to take this seriously.
Yeah, I understand that. I don't think he's coming across the border with troops, but to your point, whether you agree or not, this is as it has been at 100 different points in our country's history. This is the time for us to get our own act together. maybe he's done us a bit of a favor by saying it over and over again so that people are reacting. This is the time to get rid of internal barriers and, develop our own resources and patriate our own economy. Yeah.
And he sure has helped the Carney Liberals to do that, because they were on death's doorstep.
No, absolutely. No question.
Yeah.
There's no question about that. I want to ask one other question about, and this is just kind of a little off topic, but both of you will know that the whole discussion about nuclear energy has to come back again every time we talk about climate and about developing everything. Saskatchewan, I think, has been signing some deals on this issue. Do you know about that, Brian?
Yeah, I've written actually quite a bit about it.
Okay, give us the Coles notes.
Okay, so the short version is that a few years ago, SaskPower signed an agreement to look at developing the General Electric Hitachi BWRX 300
Are these the mini nukes, as they're called?
No, SMRs, yeah.
They're small, but small is a misnomer, because each of these units is the size of a Shan power station, 300 megawatts.
Okay.
The plan is to build at least 2 of them, possibly as many as 4, near Estevan, within 10 miles from my house, either on one reservoir or another. We haven't decided that yet. And eventually to replace our coal-fired power plants. Right. And as well, a year ago, SaskPower signed a MOU with Westinghouse, and this is very important. Westinghouse is one of the original developers of nuclear power in the world. Half the American Navy that has nuclear reactors has Westinghouse reactors. A large portion of the Western world's reactors are based on the Westinghouse design. And Westinghouse went into bankruptcy and was purchased out of bankruptcy, in part, half by Brookfield, Mr. Carney, and the other half by Cameco, which is one of Saskatchewan's corporate darlings. And what that allows is that not only will the Cameco produce the uranium, but eventually they want to have ownership of the reactors that are going, or of the company that builds reactors that's going to use the uranium. Huge vertical integration strategy here. So Premier Moe a year ago started talking about the possibility of building big reactors, 1,000 megawatt reactors, actually 1,200 megawatt. That's further down the road. But here's the thing, and this is a new development. I wrote about this just in recent weeks. Ontario's building the first design of this GE Hitachi reactor. They're building at Darlington. They're building 4 of them. That's the first ones in the world. The Poles are interested in looking at building up to 60 or 70 of these. But the second place to build these is the Tennessee Valley Authority. And they want to build their first one, actually want to build 4 of them, at Oak Ridge, Tennessee, the heart of the Manhattan Project. And SaskPower is going to be likely the third to build these, possibly. Okay. But we want to see how much they cost Ontario, how much they're going to cost Tennessee, before we pull the pin and say, yeah, we're going to build it. Well, Tennessee Valley Authority put out some planning documents last September, which I dug into, and when we convert to Canadian dollars, they're looking at the first reactor being up to 8.2 billion Canadian, and subsequent reactors being 5 billion each. The reality is the prices usually don't go down on these things. Yeah. So the expectation that further reactors will be cheaper is laughable, being that right now SaskPower is on a program of building essentially clones of large natural gas units. The first one cost $600 and something million. Second one cost $875. The third one is expected to cost 1.4 to 1.7 billion near Lanigan. So the reality is that if conventional natural gas things have seen 36 and 87% escalation between units, what can we expect for nuclear? So as a result, the minister, Jeremy Harrison, has been working on, we might actually delay our nuclear thing.
No, I'm just trying to put it in the bigger picture here, which is what's going to be the answer here. Because
he might be building coal. He's actually talking seriously about refurbishing our coal fleet.
And I think in the end, what we probably will see is I mean, my, and this is as a citizen, not, based on any, I think that the bigger reactor working with Alberta will probably be where we go. I mean, I think the SMR model, to Brian's point, I mean, is not cheap. And it's still, because there's in development aspects to it. I think, that's something to keep in mind. The other thing about nuclear in Saskatchewan, I'll just say, there was a pretty major decision that came down last week. I believe it was last week, at the Supreme Court for NextGen. NextGen is one of the companies which is exploring, more than exploring, wants to certainly mine uranium in the north of the province, along with some other newcomers, including Denison and so on. NextGen, it was held by the Supreme Court, owes the Métis Nation of Saskatchewan an extensive duty to consult. And that had, as I say, made its way all the way up to the Supreme Court. I think that's going to have pretty big ramifications and is going to have a sobering effect in terms of development, further uranium exploration in the north, because of this, really going back to the whole Bill 69 type uncertainty umbrella issue. Just another reason why companies are loath and wary to go there.
No, we are really, you use the term self-harm, but we strangle ourselves with the rules and the regulations. And it's not that people shouldn't be consulted and we shouldn't think through these projects and do all of those things. But we're very quickly getting to time is of the essence. We've spent hundreds of billions of dollars on green projects that haven't really moved the needle in any significant way. Even if we all got to net zero in Canada, it's going to have this tiny impact on the carbon footprint globally until China and India and other people step up. So,
well, the difficult thing about duty to consult in all areas of the economy is that, yes, absolutely, Indigenous peoples need to be consulted. The problem is that almost every proponent finds that the path to a yes gets to be so difficult and so long and therefore so expensive that they just throw their hands up. And I think, honestly, it behooves the First Nations people and the Métis that if they want jobs and they want support, they need to make it less difficult to get a yes.
And we've seen that happen. We've seen that happen with projects in BC and, kind of one-offs in a sense.
I think that is a big part of this malaise and the cant of the thing is that, it's almost a cliche that whatever's proposed, you can expect Indigenous opposition to it, whatever it is.
And it's like asking government to do a project, double the cost and double the time, and then you're kind of in the ballpark, right, in terms of how long it takes. So many interesting things here. We're going to be watching this because I know this issue is just really going to unfold as the campaign unfolds as well. Thank you both very much. It's good to see you guys kind of joining forces here with the different expertise you bring to the table. It's really it's a good combo.
Well,
thank you so much.
Ron's a lot smarter than I am, so.
Well, different skill set, right? Different skill set. One of these days, we're going to talk to you, Brian, about all your photojournalism, because I think that's a whole other side of you that people don't even know. So we'll do that one of these days. Brian Zinchuk, he is the editor and owner of Pipeline Online, and this is and he does this podcast with Bronwyn Eyre, former Minister of Energy and Resources in the province of Saskatchewan and former Justice Minister too. So we'll talk again, I'm sure, about Bill 69 and how it impacts some of these things. So thanks very much to the two of you for being here. And thanks to all of you for joining us today for this edition of No Nonsense with Pamela Wallen. See you very soon.